couple of kids reaching for excellence, even though we didn't realize that that's what we were doing. And we were, I think, destined to at least try to do something. And I think some of that worked out pretty well. We were a couple of little rebels who loved music and had heard a lot of music in our background, although I didn't realize that till later on. But there was a lot of music there and a lot of art. And so one thing led to another, and we were hiring out our basement studio, and people were coming from everywhere. And one thing led to another, and it was time to move out of my mother's basement and into a real studio. I got the job to build a real studio, it turns out, and Dan kept the basement studio going. And we got lots of business from Toronto, everywhere. And Dan got really good really fast. Show each other a lot of things through the years. And Dan was always a fantastic musician from day one, and so that was very helpful. Great musical ear. And I knew that about him right from the beginning. And I believe that I may unknowingly stood behind him, knowing he was going to do something great, and I thought I maybe should give him a pretty good push. Once we had our Grant Avenue studio set up, basically all heck broke loose. People came from everywhere. Willie P. Bennett, Dan and I worked on some Willie P. Bennett records together. That got us known in the area. The Time Twins came from Toronto. Folks who knew the Parachute Club folks. Recorded at our studio, at Grant Avenue Studio. And Dan did some really great work for them. And the Time Twins went to New York, met Brian Eno in a social setting, and played him the tunes. And he said, "Where did you do this?" They said, "Oh, this little studio in Hamilton. We work with a guy called Dan Lanois." "Oh, well, that sounds good." So a few weeks later, I get a call at Grant Avenue Studio. It turns out it's Brian Eno. I don't know who he is. Dan doesn't know who he is either. But he sounded pretty great, pretty charming English gentleman. And I gave him a pretty good deal, so he came up to Hamilton to record. And he never left. He just moved in with us for about 2 years. And that's when the gorgeous ambient records were done. On Land, Apollo, records with Harold Budd and John Hassel. And it was a great musical time for us, and looking back, for Hamilton.
It was very much, and still is, a sound laboratory. I think that's the way Daniel refers to the early days of Grant Avenue, and those early days in his mother's Ancaster basement when they started making records, he and Bob. Because they're away from the larger parts of the industry, they're able to experiment. They're not under the time pressures. We have to have a hit. So when Eno came to town after hearing some records that Daniel had produced, and he wanted to check out this guy, over a 2-year period, they were able to experiment in complete isolation of the industry and create what we now know as ambient music and the ambient sound.
One thing about Dan, I think he's rebelling against that whole fast-paced society and, like, you know, everything is changing. He's not rebelling. He loves living in the moment and absorbing everything and living and creating and doing things.
When we played on stage, the solo Dan was about to play was completely unpredictable. He didn't play the same one every night. And that comes from playing the same songs every night, partially, but it also comes from being brave. Some people could take the safe ground and know a great 8-bar solo and deliver it, and next night Dan comes from the opposite end with the solo, and thus is his music, you know. He takes interest in something and off he goes.
He's very well organized. He's a Virgo. And he knows where his stuff is. He knows what it's called, even if it's a working title. And he is not shy about continuing work on something that was started even years ago. Eno picked up on this quality, and I think it suited Brian very well. Not to mention Dan's fantastic experimental mind. This is where Dan and I are a little bit similar. You know, we love to look at the flip side. We love to see how far we can process the thing, distort it, twist it around, make the thing reveal another side of itself. You know, this is something that Dan and I grew up with, and I don't know where we got that necessarily. And so Brian loved this, and so they worked on these successful ambient records together. And then Dan was introduced to Peter Gabriel by Brian Eno. And that led to U2, and kind of the rest is, you know, history.